He kicked his own adopted mother out of her home, calling her a burden. But what he didn't know was she had $9.5 million hidden away. When the truth came out, his life flipped upside down, and she got the last laugh. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. Pack your bags and get out. You're not my problem anymore. Those cruel words echoed in Martha's mind as she stepped off the porch, clutching two old suitcases and her broken heart. Betty, 78 years old, Martha never imagined she'd be standing in the front yard of the house she paid for, thrown out by the boy she once cradled in her arms. She could still picture the tiny baby Ethan had been, abandoned on the church steps on a rainy night. Martha, childless and widowed young, had taken him in without a second thought. She'd worked double shifts as a cook to feed him, clothed him before herself, stayed awake through his fevers and heartbreaks, and clapped the loudest at his graduations. And now he stood in the doorway, arms stiff, finger jabbing at the street like she was a stray animal. Beside him, his wife Clara crossed her arms, her mouth twisted in a cold, victorious smile. They'd spent months whispering behind closed doors. Martha had heard the hushed voices, the sudden silence when she entered the room. She'd brushed it off as young couple troubles. She never dreamed she was the trouble. In truth, they wanted her gone. Her room for the baby they planned to have, her savings for the renovations they craved, and her name off the deed that still stubbornly bore Martha J. Brooks on the top line. Martha stopped at the edge of the porch and looked back, hoping, foolishly, that Ethan would rush forward, call her mama one more time, take back every ugly word. But his eyes were hard, not a flicker of regret in them. She thought of all the sacrifices, the birthdays she never celebrated for herself so Ethan could have parties, the new shoes she didn't buy so he'd have lunch money, the times she shielded him from the neighborhood bullies, from the law when he got into scraps as a teenager. Martha lowered her eyes, clutching the cracked leather handles of her suitcases tighter. She felt the weight of her entire life in them. Some clothes, old family photos, a chipped porcelain angel that once sat on her nightstand. As she stepped onto the front path, her legs trembling under the July sun, a neighbor's curtain twitched across the street. She wondered if they'd come offer help, but nobody did. People loved a tragedy until it asked them to do something about it. Behind her, Clara slipped an arm around Ethan's waist, resting her head on his shoulder like this was just another Wednesday. Martha couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. She'd read Clara's victory in the arch of her eyebrow months ago. How easy it is for people to forget, Martha thought, pausing by the old mailbox she had painted herself every spring for 30 years. She ran her wrinkled fingers across her name, Brooks, and wondered how long it would stay there before Ethan tore it off. A car drove by, slowing down at the sight of the old woman with her suitcases. Martha lifted her chin. She would not cry here, not in front of him, not on this land she had bought with sweat and sacrifice. She didn't know where she'd go. A friend's couch maybe. The tiny church she still visited every Sunday. Perhaps Pastor Simmons could find her a room in the back. But she knew one thing. She would survive. She'd survived worse. Her husband's death in a factory accident when she was only 29. The loneliness that had nearly swallowed her before Ethan came along. The cold nights with an empty crib, an empty heart. This was not the ending she'd hoped for. But it wouldn't be her ending. She turned back one last time. Ethan was gone from the doorway now, probably inside discussing paint colors for the nursery that would replace her room. Clara lingered on the porch, arms folded, glaring at Martha like she was a stain on her perfect life. Martha met her stare and gave her a single, small nod. Not of surrender, but of finality. You may have won him, her eyes seemed to say, but you will never erase me. With a deep breath, Martha hoisted her bags a little higher and stepped onto the sidewalk. The sun dipped behind a cloud, and a warm breeze rustled the ivy climbing the house she no longer owned. She didn't know where she'd sleep tonight, but she knew who she was. And that, she decided, was something no one could ever evict her from. What Ethan didn't know was that Martha had a secret. Years ago, when Martha's late husband, Henry, passed away, he'd left her a small life insurance policy, enough to bury him with dignity and pay off their debts, with a modest sum left over. Most widows in her shoes might have spent it on repairs, or splurged on small comforts to ease the silence of an empty house. But Martha, who knew the sting of an empty wallet too well, did something different. She went to the local library every afternoon after her shift at the diner, teaching herself about money. She read about compound interest, mutual funds, blue chip, stocks, words that made the men at the bank look at her funny when she asked too many questions. But she didn't care. With every extra dollar, she invested carefully. Sometimes it was only $5 here, $10 there. She picked safe companies, railroads, farming equipment, insurance. Every time she earned a dividend, she reinvested it. Nobody knew. Not the bank teller who greeted her with a polite nod every month when she came to deposit a little more. Not her friends at church, who thought she lived hand to mouth. Not even Ethan, who thought the old house and the aging furniture were all she owned. Over the decades, Martha's quiet discipline built into something remarkable: $9.5 million, sitting under her name in an account only she could touch. She'd never told a soul. She could have bought a bigger house. She could have taken vacations. She could have replaced the second-hand coats she wore winter after winter. But she never did. She had one dream: to leave Ethan with enough so he'd never feel the hunger she had felt as a child. She wanted to protect him, even long after she was gone. But as Martha stood alone at the end of the walkway, two battered suitcases at her feet and tears blurring the warm porch light behind her, she understood a truth too many mothers learn too late: money can't buy loyalty. Money can't buy love. She pictured Ethan's face when he was 2 days old, bundled in a blue blanket from the church donation bin. His tiny fist had wrapped around her finger, and she'd sworn to that baby that he'd never know the sharp cold of the world. She'd kept that promise all these years. But promises, she now saw, were not chains. She took a shaky breath and wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. She would not beg. She would not turn around and plead to stay in the house she'd made a home. If Ethan wanted her gone, so be it. In her pocket, her fingers found the small notebook she kept, the one with the bank account number written inside. She thought about tearing it up, leaving every penny to charity. But Martha's heart, tender despite the betrayal, whispered not yet. She still had choices. She could find a small apartment, a warm room in a retirement home. She could buy herself a soft bed, good food, heat in the winter, and the dignity she deserved. And she could do it without telling a soul where the money came from. Let Ethan think he'd gotten rid of an old burden. Let Clara think she'd won the battle for the house. Martha knew the truth. Sometimes losing the house was freedom. Sometimes the door slamming shut was just another door opening. She would live out her days on her own terms. No more cooking dinners nobody thanked her for. No more staying quiet when they snapped at her for being too slow, too old, too in the way. Someday, maybe when she was gone, Ethan might wonder where she went, what she left behind. Maybe he'd hope for an inheritance. He'd search, only to find an empty house stripped of its warmth. She could almost see his face, the same child she'd once rocked to sleep, standing alone in the echo of his greed that a single car drove by and slowed at the sight of her. This time, Martha lifted her hand and waved it on. She didn't need pity. She needed a taxi to town, a cup of hot tea, and the knowledge that she, Martha J. Brooks, was nobody's burden and never would be again. With that thought, she squared her shoulders, hoisted her suitcases, and stepped into the night. Her secret was safe, and so was her freedom. Martha didn't beg. She didn't scream. She didn't stand on that ivy-covered porch reminding Ethan of the nights she stayed up rocking him through fevers, or the birthday cakes she'd scraped coins together to bake. She didn't remind him of the times she'd sat awake in the dark, waiting for the sound of his key in the door when he stayed out too late. She didn't remind him that every light bulb in that house, every brick, every roof tile was paid for by the calluses on her hands. No. Martha just lifted her chin and walked down the driveway, the gravel crunching under her sensible shoes. She didn't look back when the door slammed shut behind her. She didn't need to see Clara's cold smirk to know it was there at the end of the street. Martha set her suitcases down and called for a taxi. The young driver raised his eyebrows at the sight of her, the old lady with the weary shoulders and the determined eyes, but he didn't ask questions. He lifted her bags into the trunk as gently as if they were made of glass. That night, Martha booked herself into a modest roadside motel on the edge of town. The wallpaper was faded and The carpet smelled faintly of old coffee, but the lock on the door worked and the bed was hers alone. For the first time in years, she slept with the blankets tucked under her chin instead of folded neatly at the foot of the bed for Ethan and Clara to take when they pleased at in the morning. She woke to birdsong instead of slammed doors and hushed arguments in the hallway. She drank her motel coffee black and called a taxi to her lawyer's office. The receptionist recognized her at once. Mrs. Brooks, always polite, always quiet, always motherly. But when Martha sat across from Mr. Harris, the lawyer who'd handled her small affairs for 20 years, she spoke with a voice like steel, wrapped in velvet. No more second chances, she told him firmly, sliding her old notebook across the desk. Mr. Harris opened it and nearly choked on his tea when he saw the account number, the balance written in Martha's neat, careful handwriting. I want every penny to go to a children's charity, one that feeds them, shelters them, protects them. Everything I thought I was doing for Ethan. He will get nothing, Martha said, her voice clear and unshakable. Mr. Harris nodded, still stunned. Are you sure, Martha? She looked out. The window at the morning sun touching the tops of the maple trees. Yes, I'm sure. Let my last gift be for children who truly need it. Children who'll grow up knowing someone cared for them without asking anything in return. When she stepped back outside, the day felt brighter somehow. The July air was warm on her face, and for the first time in decades, her shoulders didn't ache with unspoken worries. That afternoon, she found a cozy cottage by the sea, a sweet little place with white curtains and a porch swing that overlooked the waves. She paid 6 months' rent in advance, stunning the young rental agent who'd assumed she'd ask for a senior discount. Martha bought herself fresh flowers from the market, big, joyful bunches of daisies and sunflowers that filled the cottage with color and life. She stocked the fridge with her favorite teas and sweet biscuits. She unpacked her bags, folded her old clothes neatly into the drawers, and placed her chipped porcelain angel on the nightstand beside her bed. Each morning, she walked down to the shore, letting the cold ocean breeze sting her cheeks awake. She watched the gulls dive for scraps and let the sand slip through her fingers. In the afternoons, she sat on the porch swing with a book in her lap, rocking gently as the tide came and went. Sometimes she thought of Ethan, his first steps, his first tooth, the way he'd once giggled when she kissed his nose. She let herself feel the loss, but not the regret. She knew now that loving someone didn't mean letting them break you. When the ache in her chest got too heavy, she pictured all the children her fortune would help, children whose hungry bellies would be filled, whose tiny hands would hold new pencils, whose tears would be wiped by people who wouldn't see them as burdens. She pictured her love spreading out like ripples in the sea before her, touching lives she'd never meet. And when she turned out the light each night, Martha smiled to herself. Her house might be gone, her family might have failed her, but her heart was finally hers to keep safe. And for the first time in a long, long time, she slept soundly, knowing no one could ever evict her peace again. Back at the big old house, Ethan didn't miss Martha at first. In fact, those first few days felt like a triumph. He and Clara tore down the floral curtains Martha had hung decades ago and replaced them with sleek blinds from a catalog Clara had circled for months. They cleared out her room in a single afternoon. Her old rocking chair tossed onto the curb, her faded quilts stuffed into garbage bags. Clara moved in a new desk, set up her laptop, and called it her home office. They used Martha's pension checks to upgrade the kitchen, new granite countertops, shiny appliances that hummed instead of rattled. They cooked fancy meals they'd seen on cooking shows, posted photos online of their fresh start, toasted their new freedom with wine too expensive for the old, drafty house they still called theirs. They talked about vacations they'd never taken before, Italy, maybe, or Greece. Clara dreamed out loud about how they'd finally have the nursery they wanted once they paid off a few debts. Ethan didn't tell her about the unease that sometimes tugged at the back of his mind when he passed the empty doorway that had been Martha's room. He pushed it down, poured another glass of wine, and told himself he was better off. But weeks turned into months, and the mailbox began to fill with things they hadn't planned for. Bills with Martha's name still on them. Strange notices. Past due reminders stamped in angry red ink. Ethan tore one open and frowned. Mortgage balance due. He crumpled it up and threw it out, certain it was some clerical mistake. But the letters kept coming. He called the bank one rainy morning, after Clara pressed him about it for the third time. He expected a polite answer, maybe a small fee to clear up. Instead, the woman on the line asked him for a payment he didn't have, money Martha had quietly sent every month for years to keep the roof over their heads. Martha had paid off nearly everything herself. Property taxes, repairs, overdue balances Ethan thought had just gone away. Without her checks, the house began to swallow him whole. And then, just when he thought it couldn't get worse, came the worst shock of all. The letter from Martha's lawyer at IT arrived in a stiff, white envelope, heavy in Ethan's trembling hands. Clara stood behind him at the kitchen island as he read it once, then twice, his mouth going dry. Martha's will had been updated just days after she left. Ethan was cut out completely, no mention of him, no last gift to soften the blow. The house would be sold off to cover debts. And the rest? The lawyer's words were polite, but each line burned like ice. Martha's fortune, the millions Ethan never even knew existed, were gone, left to a children's charity that would feed and shelter strangers who had never even met her. Clara's face turned pale when Ethan read it out loud. She opened her mouth to argue, to ask where the money had come from, why Martha had hidden it. But the answers didn't matter. The money was gone. And with it, their plans, the kitchen upgrade, the Italian honeymoon, the nursery they'd started painting a soft green. They fought then, the way people do when the blame has nowhere good to land. Clara hurled cruel words about how he should have been nicer, how he should have known. Ethan shouted back about how she'd driven Martha out. They stomped through rooms that felt emptier now, Martha's presence hanging heavier in absence than I'd ever had when she was alive. He tried to find her. He called the lawyer, begged for an address. He drove by the old church, asked neighbors who shrugged, and said, "She's gone." He sat up at night dialing her old phone number, half hoping she'd answer, half dreading she would. But Martha didn't answer. Martha didn't come back. Instead, Martha sat on her new porch overlooking the sea. She sipped hot tea in the mornings as the tide rolled in and out. She walked barefoot along the sand at dusk. She sent small donations to the charity she'd chosen, smiling at each letter that came back with photos of children holding warm meals and new coats. Some nights, she thought about Ethan, her baby boy, now a man standing alone in an empty house, wondering how he'd lost everything when all he had to do was love her enough to keep her. But those thoughts passed like waves against the shore, here, then gone. Because Martha was free now, free to live the quiet, gentle life she'd earned with every sacrifice, every heartbreak. And for the first time, no one could take it away. One crisp morning, with the ocean breeze carrying the scent of salt and wildflowers, Martha sat on an old park bench tossing breadcrumbs to a flock of eager little birds. She came here every Wednesday, a warm pastry tucked in her bag for herself, and a paper bag of crumbs for her feathered visitors. This morning, though, she wasn't alone. A young reporter had been waiting near the park gate, a slim notepad in one hand, a camera slung awkwardly over his shoulder. He'd heard the whispers that drifted through town about the elderly woman who'd given millions to an orphanage but lived like she owned nothing more than a cozy rented cottage by the sea. He approached her gently, not wanting to scare away the birds. "Mrs. Brooks?" he asked, voice respectful, almost reverent. Martha didn't look up at first. She scattered the last of her crumbs, watching a bold little sparrow hop close enough to peck them straight from her shoe. Finally, she lifted her eyes, sharp but kind, the sort of eyes that made you feel seen all the way down to your bones. "Yes?" she said, her voice soft but steady. The reporter shifted his weight, cleared his throat, then asked the question he'd been sent for. "People want to know, do you regret it? Not giving the money to your son?" The question lingered in the salty air. Martha's lips curved into a small, tired smile, the kind of smile that held 1,000 sleepless nights and just as many small, quiet joys. She shook her head slowly. "Family isn't about blood," she said, her voice gentle but firm, each word measured like she was placing stones on a path for him to follow. "It's about how you treat people when they have nothing to give you in return." She paused to brush a crumb off her skirt. "He made his choice," she continued, glancing at the birds fluttering away as a dog barked nearby. And I made mine. The reporter tried to press her for more. A comment on Ethan's betrayal, on the bitterness he must feel now, alone in that big house stripped of warmth and paid lies. But Martha simply thanked him for his time and stood to leave, brushing off her coat like she was dusting off the past itself. Back at the house, Ethan stood alone on the once grand porch where he had so proudly pointed his mother away like she was nothing but an inconvenience. Now he was the one with bags packed at his feet, cheap suitcases that looked suspiciously like the ones Martha had carried that day, all those months ago. The new owners had arrived that morning with a real estate agent and a polite but unyielding smile. The house would be gutted, sold to pay off the mountain of debts Ethan had uncovered too late. Clara had left weeks ago, tired of broken promises and unpaid bills. There was no more granite kitchen, no nursery, no dream vacation waiting for them on a vision board. Only the empty echo of what they'd thought they deserved. He lingered on the porch, staring at the ivy creeping up the posts, the same green vines Martha had planted when she first bought the place. He thought of her quiet footsteps in the hallway, her soft humming while she folded his laundry, the warm dinners he'd once pushed away with barely a thank you. But there was no humming now, no warmth, just silence and the cold slap of regret. Meanwhile, Martha's story spread far and wide. Papers called her wise, strong, even ruthless. The photo of her in the park, a bird perched fearlessly on her knee, made the front page in town. Some people whispered about how she'd been too harsh, cutting her own son off like that. Others called her an inspiration, proof that a mother's love could be fierce and fair. Martha didn't care about the stories, the headlines, the opinions that flickered like streetlights and then went out. She cared about the children who, tonight, would sleep in warm beds because of her. Children who would eat hot meals, open books filled with worlds they'd never imagined, and hold hands with kind strangers who believed they were worth the fight. She cared about the second chances she'd handed out freely, just not to those who squandered them. And on quiet evenings, wrapped in a blanket on her porch by the sea, Martha hoped that somewhere down the line, those children would grow up to remember her not by name, but by the truth she'd lived by. Love isn't owed. It's earned. Respect isn't automatic. It's built with every kindness, every sacrifice, every promise kept when no one's watching. And when you bite the hand that feeds you, you'd better be ready for the day that hand stops offering and starts holding tight to the very thing you wish you hadn't thrown away. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more true life lessons and eye-opening tales. What would you have done if you were Martha? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I love reading what you think. Thanks for watching, and remember, respect and kindness always come back around. See you in the next video.